Sometimes the tallest buildings cast the longest shadows, even on the people who built their foundations. What happens when the past walks straight into the future without an appointment? Let us know in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to follow more powerful stories that honor the heart of our veterans. Tony Bedingfield never liked asking for anything. At 78 years old, he still stood straight, his spine like iron under the weight of time. His eyes, steel gray and sharp, had seen jungles, deserts, and battlefields far from the glass and chrome skyline that loomed above him now. But none of those sights rattled him like the double doors in front of him, revolving slowly, one after the other, spitting out men in slim suits and women in heels that clicked across the marble like clockwork. He stood just outside them, hand resting on the handle of a worn leather satchel. Inside was the photo, the one he'd kept folded in his breast pocket since 1993. He had ironed it out last night with the back of a spoon so it would look presentable. Not that creases mattered to Zachary. At least, they never used to. Tony exhaled slowly and stepped inside the lobby of Whitestone Dynamics, 42 floors of polished stone, rising ambition, and cold shoulders. The first thing he noticed wasn't the architecture. It was the silence that wrapped around his boots. The way sound seemed to vanish beneath the weight of money and time. Even the reception desk looked like something carved from a glacier, manned by a woman who didn't lift her head when he stepped up. "Morning," Tony said, voice low and gravelly. "I'm here to see my grandson, Zachary Bedingfield." The woman didn't blink. She kept her eyes on the screen, her fingers typing faster than most people could think. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, ma'am," he replied politely. "But if you could tell him Tony Bedingfield is here, I think he'd—" "I'm sorry," she said, finally glancing at him, tone clipped. "Without an appointment, I can't notify anyone. That's policy." Tony nodded, the way Marines do when they've been told to hold position. "I'll wait." She paused, looked at him again. Perhaps it was the creased photo in his hand or the way he didn't argue, didn't plead, but she simply returned to her screen, and Tony turned toward the seating area, a row of designer chairs that looked like art installations more than furniture. He didn't sit. Instead, he found a quiet corner of the lobby and stood beside the steel column, photo in hand. He didn't need to look at it again. He knew the faces too well. A young boy in a red ball cap sitting on his shoulders, arms spread like wings. A much younger Tony, back straight even then. His smile, rare but real. He didn't notice the security guards until they approached. "Sir," the taller one said, voice overly firm, "we're going to need you to step outside." Tony turned. "I'm just waiting for my grandson. He works here." "Did you check in with the front desk?" "Yes, I tried. She said I needed an appointment." The second guard crossed his arms. "Then I'm sorry, sir, but we can't have loitering in the lobby, especially not with unverified guests." "I served in the Marines for 30 years, Tony said, his voice low and calm. "I don't loiter. I wait." The first guard glanced at the other, then stepped forward. "This building has procedures, and right now you're not following them, so either you come with us outside, or we'll be forced to—" That's when the elevator dinged. All three turned. Out stepped a man in a charcoal suit tailored to the inch, his silver tie catching the overhead lights. His stride was confident, but not rushed. He wasn't a man accustomed to being late. His assistant whispered something in his ear as they passed, but the CEO had already spotted the old man in the lobby. He stopped. The entire lobby seemed to pause with him. "Tony?" Zach's voice cut through the hum of business chatter. The guards turned as one. The receptionist stood up. Tony didn't move. Zach dropped his tablet onto the assistant's clipboard and walked. Fast now, toward the man he hadn't seen in over a decade. "Tony Bedingfield?" he asked again, quieter now. Tony gave a slow nod. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" Zach said, voice catching on the edges of breath. Tony held up the photo. "Didn't think I had to." There was a pause. Not awkward, just long enough for Zach's face to shift, the sharp corporate mask melting into something human, something familiar. The CEO turned to the two security guards, who now looked like they wanted to vanish into the marble. "Is there a reason?" Zach said quietly. "My grandfather, a decorated Marine and the man who raised me, was about to be escorted off the premises?" Neither guard answered. Zach didn't wait for one. "Take a walk," he said flatly. "Both of you." They obeyed. Zach turned back, clearing his throat. "Come on. Let's get out of this fishbowl." Tony nodded, but didn't move right away. His hand clenched around the photo once more, just enough to feel it again. Not the paper. The memory. Only then did he follow Zach toward the private elevator, where legacy, regret, and overdue truths waited on the upper floors. The private elevator doors closed with a hush, sealing them in. The hum of the lobby vanished, and with it the tension that had clung to Tony's shoulders. Zach stood beside him, hands folded in front of him like a man preparing to speak at a memorial. The silence between them wasn't new. It had existed for years. For birthdays missed, letters unread, and phone calls unanswered. Zach cleared his throat, glancing at the mirrored wall of the elevator, then at his grandfather. "You haven't changed." Tony didn't look away from the floor numbers ticking upward. "You have." Zach smiled faintly, but it didn't last. "Yeah, well, I guess suits'll do that." Tony turned his head just slightly. "No, it's not the suit. It's the way you didn't recognize me at first." Zach blinked, guilt settling behind his eyes. I was in a meeting. I wasn't expecting." Tony raised a hand, not in anger, but finality. "Son, if I walked into that building when you were 5, you'd have run to me before I took a second step." They stood in the thick quiet again, and the elevator stopped at floor 36. Zach reached for the panel and pressed a code. "Not this floor. We're going up to the executive lounge." Quieter. The next 6 floors passed slower. "Why didn't you write back?" Tony asked, not accusing, just curious. Zach looked down at his shoes, black leather, polished enough to reflect light. "I read every letter. I just didn't know what to say." "That I mattered," Tony said softly. "That the man who raised you after your parents died meant something to the boy who used to sit on his lap during taps." Zach winced. The weight of words, when spoken by a man who never wasted them, always landed hard. The elevator finally opened to a private suite. All glass, rich wood, and soft lighting. No noise, no staff. Just the ghost of wealth in the corners. Tony stepped in slowly. He didn't look impressed. He looked like a man trying to understand how the grandson he raised built something so high, yet drifted so far. Zach motioned to the leather armchairs by the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Sit?" Tony nodded once and eased himself into the chair, his knees cracking like brittle paper. He placed the photo on the small table between them. Zach didn't reach for it. He just stared at it, like it was a window to a time he wasn't ready to revisit. "You remember that day?" Tony asked. "Yeah," Zach said. "You took me to the base. I saluted every officer who passed." Tony cracked a smile. "You saluted the janitor, too." Zach laughed quietly. "You didn't correct me. You were 5. Your heart was in the right place. And truth be told, that janitor served in Korea." Zach looked away. Tony leaned forward. "You forgot, didn't you? Where you come from?" "No," Zach replied quickly. "I didn't forget. I just tried not to think about it." Tony's face remained still, but his eyes flicked with something raw. "Why?" Zach stood and walked toward the window, hands in his pockets, voice low. "Because remembering meant confronting the fact that I left you behind. That I climbed all the way up this tower and didn't look back." Tony tilted his head, voice steady. You made something of yourself. That was always the goal. Ha! Yeah, but at what cost? Zach turned around, jaw tight. I spent years telling myself I was too busy, too focused. That one more merger, one more quarter, and then I'd fly back, visit the old house, maybe take you to lunch, but time just slipped. Tony nodded slowly. It does that. Silence again, but not the cold kind. This one was heavy with thoughts unspoken. I came today, Tony said, because I had a checkup last week. VA doc found something. He said it's probably nothing, but you know how they always say that when it's probably something. Zach's body froze. You're sick? Don't know yet. Might be fine, might not. Zach swallowed hard, hands trembling just slightly at his sides. Why didn't you call? Would you have answered? The question wasn't sharp, but it cut anyway. Zach sat down. I don't know. Tony leaned back, hand resting on his chest. I wasn't coming here to lay guilt on you. I came because I had one photo left. One thing I hadn't done. To look you in the eye and say, no matter how far you drifted, I never stopped loving you. I never stopped being proud. Zach turned his face to the side, wiping at his cheek like he had dust in his eye. I don't deserve that. Doesn't matter, Tony said. That's the thing about love. It's not about what you earn. They sat there, two men separated by time and silence, and yet, finally, together. Zach looked at the photo again, then at his grandfather. You'll stay the night. I'll cancel everything tomorrow. We'll talk. Tony nodded. I'd like that. Zach stood, then did something he hadn't done since he was 12. He bent down and hugged the old man. Tightly. Like a son who didn't want to let go again. And this time, Tony didn't have to wait. The next morning began without ceremony. Tony sat at the edge of the guest bed in Zach's penthouse suite, tugging on his boots like he had every morning since the Marines taught him to prepare before dawn. No matter how soft the mattress or clean the sheets, his body still woke with the sun. Years of discipline refused to loosen their grip, not even for age. He stood, joints protesting quietly, and stared at himself in the bathroom mirror. Same worn face, same silver stubble, same scar under his chin, barely visible now from a stray piece of shrapnel in Da Nang. His eyes lingered on that scar a moment longer than usual, as if asking it a question he hadn't yet figured out how to ask aloud. The smell of coffee drifted in, rich, expensive, probably French. Tony stepped into the living area, where Zach was already dressed in jeans and a gray hoodie, a departure from yesterday's corporate armor. The change looked good on him. Softer. Less like the man on magazine covers and more like the boy who once begged to ride shotgun in his grandfather's beat-up Ford. Morning, Zach said without looking up. I made too much coffee. Hope that's all right. Tony grunted, half amused. You make coffee like a recruit makes excuses. Too much, too fast. Zach smirked. Touche. Tony poured a cup. No sugar, no cream. Black like always. They sat across from each other at the long kitchen island. The city stretched wide beneath the tall windows, but neither looked out. Their world for now was just the two of them and the echo of the years they'd let drift between. Zach tapped the rim of his mug. Do you remember that time I tried to run away? I packed a backpack with crackers and a flashlight and made it 3 blocks before you picked me up in the truck? Tony nodded slowly. Left a note on your pillow. Said you were going to find your real family. Zach chuckled, rubbing his forehead. Yeah. You drove next to me at walking pace for a whole block, not saying a word. Just followed me. I was mad too. I thought for sure you'd yell. I was too busy trying not to laugh, Tony replied. Told myself I'd let you walk until your little legs gave out. You waited until I asked for a ride. That's the only way boys learn. Zach leaned back in his stool, You always did that, never forced anything, never guilt-tripped, just waited. Tony didn't respond right away. He sipped his coffee, let the silence do its work. Finally he said, "You were never mine, Zach, not officially. But after your parents died, I knew if I didn't step in, you'd be swallowed up by the system. I didn't know how to be a father again. I barely remembered how to be a husband after your grandma passed." Zach looked up. "You were more of a father than anyone else ever was." Tony's face remained still. Only his hand tightened around the mug. "You should have called sooner," Zach said, the weight creeping back into his voice. "I should have done more. Reached out. Anything." Tony raised his head. "I didn't want to interrupt your life." Zach shook his head. "You were never an interruption. I was just scared. Scared you'd see what I'd become and not recognize me. Or worse, be disappointed." Tony blinked slowly, like the words took longer to settle than expected. "Son," he said, his voice like worn gravel, "I've seen men in war lose everything and still find their way back. I've seen boys cry in foxholes and come out men. And I've seen some never come back at all. So don't talk to me about being scared of what success does to a man. The only thing that ever matters is whether or not you remember where you came from." Zach looked down. "I forgot. For a long time. But now you remember," Tony said, setting his mug down with finality. "So what are you going to do with that?" The question wasn't rhetorical. Not to Tony. Zach exhaled through his nose. "First, I'm going to cancel my trip to San Francisco. Then I'm going to call Donna at the foundation and tell her we're setting up that scholarship fund, the one I always said I'd start for military families." Tony nodded. "That's a good start. I want you to help me design it." "Me?" Tony raised an eyebrow. "You," Zach said firmly. "I want your name on it, not mine." Tony looked out the window now, finally letting his gaze stretch past the glass and into the city. "You sure? That might get you fewer headlines." "I don't want headlines," Zach said. "I want to do something real, something that says, 'Thank you to the man who showed me what service really means.'" The elevator chimed before Tony could respond. Zach stood, confused. Not expecting anyone. He opened the door, and there, flanked by two young staffers, was a delivery man, holding a wide box with a brass-plated frame inside. Zach signed, took the package, and brought it in. He opened it carefully at the table. Inside was a blown-up photo professionally restored of the exact one Tony had carried into the building yesterday. Only now it was enlarged, matted, and set inside a thick walnut frame. Zach turned it toward him. "For your house?" Tony stared. "You had it in your pocket all these years. Figured it belonged on a wall." For a long moment Tony said nothing, but his eyes shimmered, just slightly. Then he smiled. "I think," he said, "it finally found the right place." 3 weeks later, the lobby of Whitestone Dynamics looked almost the same, polished, humming, sterile. But a quiet change had begun to take root. The guards who once stood stiff and dismissive now nodded at each person who entered. They didn't just watch. They observed. And behind the front desk a framed photograph now hung on the wall, not far from the company's mission statement. It was the photo, the one Tony had carried, now framed with care and purpose. Below it a plaque read, "Tony Bedingfield, USMC. Because honor doesn't wear expiration dates." It had been Zach's idea, but Tony's words. The CEO insisted that every employee walk past that plaque when they came through the doors. No one questioned it. Some asked who he was. Others had already heard. That morning Tony returned, not as a guest, but as a man invited. He walked through the lobby as people paused, whispered, smiled. Even the receptionist, the same woman from before, stood and greeted him properly this time. "Good morning, Mr. Bedingfield," she said, with a gentle smile. "Your grandson is expecting you." Tony tipped his head, that old-fashioned way he did with everyone from busboys to generals. "Thank you, ma'am." Upstairs, the energy felt different. Zach had changed his corner office, not in size, but in substance. The long wall of press clippings and awards was now shared by new frames, photos of veterans, handwritten thank-you notes from families, and a shadow box containing the ribbons and medals Tony had given him a week ago. Tony stepped into the office, eyes scanning the room with deliberate calm. "Morning," Zach said, standing from behind his desk, wearing jeans and a crisp white shirt. "Right on time." "Always am," Tony replied. "The Corps didn't raise late men." Zach chuckled. "Got something to show you. Come with me." They walked through the main floor together, passing rows of desks where employees turned to look, most offering nods, some offering more. "Thank you for your service, sir," said a younger man near the window, standing as they passed. Tony simply gave him a glance and a nod, not stopping. "Glad someone remembers." They entered a new wing of the floor, still under construction a week ago. Now polished brass signage hung above the doorway, the Bedingfield Initiative for Veterans and Their Families. Tony froze. He stared at the sign, then at Zach, who simply gestured him in. Inside, a team of 5 people were already working. Veterans all. A woman with a prosthetic arm was typing at a computer. A man with a silver star and an easy smile spoke to a client over the phone. Another, older gentleman with Air Force wings above his name badge nodded as they entered. "This," Zach said, "is our new arm: counseling, legal services, housing referrals, scholarships. We've got partners in the city lined up. This floor is for them, for us, for you." Tony stepped forward, the weight of the years suddenly bending his shoulders just slightly. "I didn't expect this," he murmured. "You gave everything for this country," Zach said. "It was time something gave back." Tony turned, taking in the room. The framed flag above the desk, the Marine motto etched into the glass divider, the small kitchen with a sign that read, "For veterans, coffee's always free." It wasn't about the grandness, it was the details, the understanding. They left the floor to applause, not choreographed, just quiet clapping from those who recognized what was being honored. Tony didn't speak until they were back in the private elevator. He looked at Zach. "I thought I came to that building weeks ago to remind you of who you were." Zach raised an eyebrow, and Tony's voice dropped low. "Turns out you remembered just fine. You just needed someone to say it out loud." Zach smiled. "Well, you've always been the best man for that job." That afternoon, in a small courtyard tucked behind the building, an informal ceremony took place. No media, no cameras, just family, friends, and staff gathered as Zach stepped forward with a certificate. Tony didn't read it right away. He just stared at the golden seal, then up at his grandson. "I had these made," Zach said. "One for every vet who walks through that office. But the first one, it belongs to the man who taught me what service looks like." Tony didn't cry, not exactly, but when he took the certificate and tucked it under his arm, his other hand went to Zach's shoulder, and it stayed there a long time. As the day wound down, they sat on a bench beneath a tree that hadn't yet bloomed. "You know," Tony said, watching pigeons strut across the stone path, "when I first showed up here, I thought I'd be turned away and forgotten. But now—" He trailed off. Zach waited. "Now I see something I thought I'd lost a long time ago." "What's that?" Zach asked. Tony looked at him, eyes steady and proud. "Legacy." A moment passed, the kind that only 2 generations bound by love and sacrifice could truly share. "You hungry?" Zach asked, standing. Tony smiled faintly. "If you've got a place that serves meatloaf and doesn't have a wine list, I'm in." Zach laughed. "I know just the place." They walked off together, shoulder to shoulder. No distance left between them, no words unspoken. Just a grandfather and his grandson, and the quiet, steady promise that from now on they'd walk side by side.